WhiskyJason here, whiskey from the viewpoint of an American in Germany, often reviewing rare and exotic whiskeys. This is rare and exotic, Ballechin. This is a single cask, 20-year-old peated product from the Edradour Distillery. Whiskybase number 262530. Now, this was distilled on the 25th of July, 2004, the same date that Andrew Symington Jr. was born. We're going to be talking about Andrew Symington a lot today. This was bottled on the 25th of July, 2024, so exactly 20 years of age. We have here cask number 347. We have 691 bottles, and we have a alcohol strength, cask strength of 54.7%. Now, the recommended retail price over here in Germany was 239 euros. The first bottles are now being sold for 219 euros, so 20 euros off, about 10% discount. I want to talk about Andrew Symington. He's the guy behind Signatory Vintage. He's the guy behind Edradour. He's the guy behind Ballechin. All right, so I'm not going to taste the whiskey for probably the next 10 to 12 minutes, all right? So if you're here for the whiskey, go find someone else who reviewed it. I'm going to tell you the story here of Ballechin. Now, in 1988, Andrew Symington, at the age of 25, scraped together 2,500 pounds to buy a cask of 1968 Glenlivet. Now, that was back then 20-year-old whiskey. And he had it arranged to be bottled. That was the beginning of Signatory Vintage Scotch Whisky Company Limited. Now, this 25-year-old Andrew Symington, he's basically 7 years older than I am. He was an assistant manager at the time at a very small but very fine luxury hotel at a golf course in Edinburgh. And therefore, he knew a little bit about blended whiskeys. He knew a little bit about single malts and so on. And he had contacts to bottlers and to distilleries and to blenders. And with this, suddenly an idea started to form in his head. It's like, could I actually set up a company for single cask bottlings? Different single malts, different ages, different vintages, different distilleries. Would that be possible? Now, Andrew is the son of a legal professional, and his brother Brian and him, they borrowed 100,000 pounds, and they said, we're going to actually start our company in life. That was the traditional hub for the whiskey blenders, the brokers, and even the wine buyers and sellers. And the name Signatory was very unique because the thought was that certain personalities from the world of Scotland, Scotch, whiskey, and so on would actually sign their signatory, as a guarantee of the quality of these bottlings. Now, basically no one ever did it. The only real exception to this is the Edradour Caledonia bottlings. So we have there Dougie MacLean. He was a folk icon, and he gave his favorite song, Caledonia, which is part of the Scottish culture, to the branding of that 15-year-old whiskey from Edradour. So now, Andrew, a workaholic, went out there, went to the different distilleries, went to the different warehouses, always trying to smell and taste and find those gems. All right, so he always was looking for those and often found it. It's really interesting. One of the first things he did, one of the milestones of the company, was a 1968 distilled cask of a 31-year-old Ben Wyvis. distillery. The distillery had already closed 1976, and he was able to actually bottle that. Now, in the year 1994, he did something radically different. He had a sherry cask of a 22-year-old malt from the Killylock Lowland Distillery. Never heard of it. Closed distillery as well. And he used dumpy bottles. That's what this is. This is a dumpy bottle. This is a standard bottle that is also used, cheaper, but he used the dumpy bottle. All right, so he actually filled up 230 of these dumpy bottles from this 22-year-old Killylock distillery. And he used this very, very simple structure that we have today. That up until that point in 1994, hardly anyone, and I mean almost no one in the entire whiskey industry had used. He actually put on the label, distilled on. He gave us a date of distillation. Bottled on. He gave us the date of bottling. He gave us the cask number. Unheard of almost back then. He gave us the quantity of bottles. No one had ever done that as far as I know. He gave us the cask type, and he gave us, of course, the age with the ABV. And even back then, natural color, non-chilled filtered. Andrew Symington is the guy who actually gave us transparency in the whiskey industry. No one up until that time, and that's only 30 years ago, was actually doing that. Now, many of his bottlings back then were 43, 46. Some of them were cask strength. But this was the secret of his success. Now, he was able to find these excellent casks that were one-offs often. And a big brand would just look at it, I'm not going to bottle something. I'm not going to bottle a single cask. I'm not going to stop my production line where there's 5,000 bottles an hour going through that to fill up 200 bottles of something. They would literally back then just take a 30-year-old single malt from a closed distillery, dump it into a blend and say, okay, we got rid of it. It's great. And Andrew saw these gems. He saw and experienced and tasted and shared this with us as a community and gave us things that we will never have again. So he had back then like a range of whiskeys called silent stills. These were all closed distilleries. Don't forget, 80s just basically blocked out a lot of just closed a lot of distilleries back then. And he started back then the cask strength collection, a unique thing. The unchilled filtered collection. I mean, come on. Today, that's what we want. That's what we expect. But 30 years ago, that was almost one-of-a-kind type of thing. So unique. And so Andrew Symington would actually become the pioneer of a new movement within whiskey. He wanted the entire aroma, the entire taste to be delivered to us. And that was something that was literally not normal back then. So, we are going to now move over to his next big thing. Andrew had bottled a lot. He has casks all over the island in different warehouses that he's owned and waiting to be bottled. He says, I want my own distillery. At the very beginning, he looked at Ardbeg. Closed back then, if I'm correct. So I want to buy it. I want to have it. And it was like, that was too big of a number. So Travis Regal said, hey, we have the smallest distillery in Scotland, Edradour. You can get it. You can have it. Now, I think I forgot to mention is Andrew Symington had worked as a bartender in Munich. He actually married a German woman from Annette, and they speak and understand, at least perfectly, and speak German in their home. I think that's great as someone in Germany here. And so what they did is they actually scraped enough money together to go buy this distillery, Edradour. And they renovated, first of all, the dunnage warehouses so they could bring all the casks together that were possible, have them there. They actually set up a bottling line so they could actually bottle their own bottles there. And the British whiskey magazine, actually named him the bottler of the year in 2002 and 2003. 2001, he was actually included in that very sacred circle of the masters, the keepers of the Cache. And yeah. So what he did is he built his own distillery. Now, when am I finally going to talk about Ballechin? Now. He asked the former Lafroig distillery manager, Ian Henderson, to come up to his place and help him produce a peated whiskey. Now, Ian Henderson had over 40 years in the whiskey industry. He understood what it takes to mash, to ferment, to distill something like a peated whiskey. And so in spring of 2003, Ian Henderson actually distilled the first peated whiskey on the pot stills in Edradour. And in 2006, Ballechin was released to the world. 50 ppm is what they went for. Henderson wanted this richly flavored single malt to remind people of Islay, even though it was made in the islands. Now, the one thing I don't know is where do they get their peated malt from? Now, I have a friend who worked there. I could have asked Andre from Whiskey Tales, and it's too late, and I didn't. But if you know, put it down there. What I do know is where the name Ballechin came from. There was a distillery called Ballechin, very close to Aberfeldy, that closed in 1927. Now, there's this historian, this guy who wrote about all the different whiskey distilleries, Alfred Barnard, in the 1880s. He wrote about Ballechin, and he described the malt barns. He described the peated single malt that was made there. And now Andrew Symington said, hey, we found our name. It's a distillery that's closed. We're going to take it. We're going to use it. So we have our unpeated Edradour. We have our peated. We have our Ballechin. Ta-da! And that's the way it happened. All right. Did you know those facts? I didn't. I must admit, most of the facts, most of the information I now was given to me here from a friend of mine. Annie is what I call him, but his name is Ants J. Scheiner. And he wrote in the Highland Herald, which is a German whiskey magazine, in 2016, in edition number 30, about that. So he was a distillery, he interviewed Andrew and so on. And so this is almost 9 years ago, where this was done here. And so, yes, that's a little bit of information. What am I going to compare this whiskey to? Just because I can and just because I want to. I have here the Newport Charlotte, the SYC, that's Syrah. And this is 10-year-old whiskey, 54.4. This is 20-year-old whiskey, 54.7. This is about 230. This is about 115. So half the price, half the age. Half the taste, we'll have to find out here. So I am not a peat head. So I gave you a lot of information. I gave you a lot of history. be happy. My tasting notes are really not going to be that great because all I get is peat. All right, so now on the nose, I get a lot of ash. I get a little bit of barbecue smoke, and I get a little bit of a fruitiness. But I get a whole lot of peatiness. It's as if you had heavy metal music screaming in my ears. That's what the peat is. And you ask me now to listen to a classical music or a little bit of smooth jazz and pick out the nuances. I can. All I have is that peat there. This, on the other hand, there's hardly any peat in comparison. This is a peat monster. This is 50 ppm. This is 40 ppm. This is fruity. This is silky. This is creamy. I know you can't really smell creaminess, but this is interesting. This is just brutal. This is bam, peat. I bought the bottle, did a bottle share, it's gone. So let's try it. But I got to talk about Andrew Symington, and I got to talk about the history of Ballechin. And I mentioned Ian Henderson, the guy from Lefroy that made this, basically, that created this style of whiskey for him. Wow. A lot of ash, a lot of peat, a lot of smoke. Now I can get a tiny little bit of berry sweetness. I'm sorry, I don't get the port that much. Now, there's this guy here, I think he's from Poland, Malt Vader. He wrote here on Whiskybase. I'm going to steal his notes, all right? He says, ash from the ashtray on the nose, tobacco, wood, the aromas of a barn, smoke from the grill, sweet red fruits, cherries and chocolate emerge from under all this. Wonderful, I can't get it. As a taste, he talks about sweet red fruits. He talked about grilled smoke. How can you grill smoke? I would talk about barbecue smoke. Spicy oak chips, pepper, ash, cigar box, dusty attic, which I really like as a descriptor, honey and a touch of spice. That's his tasting notes. And the finish is long and spicy, lots of ash, smoke and tobacco, spices, chocolate, cherries. That's what he gets. I don't. Now, I can get this whiskey. The Port Charlotte is okay for me. I get the nuances. I get the layers here. That is so much more up my alley. I can't even tell you. As I said, about 115, 230. What would I buy? This. But Jason is only 10 years old. This is 20. 20 older is better. No, it's not necessarily better. That's got flavor. That's got nice. Ooh, I'm doing a separate review about this soon. All right. So my question of the day is, what is your favorite Edradour Ballechin product? My question of the day is, where do they get their peated malt from? My question of the day is, what is the next independent bottler, Andrew Symington, Edradour, that is going to either build their own distillery or buy their own distillery? Elixirs have done it. They have Tormore. They're building their own little distillery on Isla as well as we talk. Others have done it. Gordon MacPhail, Ben Romach, and many, many others. Who's next? Thank you very much for watching, liking, subscribing, and see you real soon. Hope you learned something. Whiskey Jason out. Bye-bye.